Last summer, during one of those strange, restless periods of my life, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had no grand ambitions. I was not a seasoned outdoorsman seeking to conquer the wilderness. I simply wanted a day and night away from the crowds, the constant digital hum of the modern world, and the suffocating weight of my daily responsibilities. It felt harmless enough. I thought that getting lost in nature, even just for a short while, would give my mind some much-needed quiet. I chose a forest about an hour-and-a-half's drive from my small town in Vermont. It was not a national park or any sort of tourist magnet, which suited me. I wanted solitude, not hiking families or chattering groups of scouts. My plan was simple: park at a trailhead, follow a moderately marked trail deep into the forest, set up my small tent, stay the night, and return in the morning. When I arrived at the main trail, I was disheartened to see 3 cars already parked along the roadside. I knew what that meant. People, conversation, noise, exactly what I was trying to avoid. So I made a decision that felt harmless at the time, but would come to haunt me. I kept driving. About another 5 miles down the narrow forest road, I spotted a faded dirt path veering off into the trees. There were no other cars nearby and no gravel lot, just that thin trail disappearing into the foliage. I parked on a patch of grass beside the road, grabbed my gear, and set off. The trail was narrow, only wide enough for a single person. It weaved between towering pines and thick brush. The canopy above filtered the daylight, casting everything in a greenish, muted glow. At first, the path was easy enough to follow, though it clearly had not been used in some time. Small plants and roots had begun reclaiming it. As I walked deeper, the forest changed. The undergrowth thickened. The path narrowed further. Birds quieted. The trees stood taller, closer together. I glanced at my phone more than once, not for service, there was none, but just to mark the time. I guessed I had been walking for about 2 hours when the trail began to vanish entirely beneath the moss and ferns. That should have been my cue to turn back. I realized that now, but the deeper I had gone, the less inclined I felt to reverse course. Some stubborn instinct told me I could always retrace my steps. That was when I noticed the cabin. It stood unexpectedly among the trees, partially obscured by hanging branches and overgrowth. The wood was aged and gray, the roof sagging in the middle as though burdened by years of snow and rain. There was no door, just a black rectangle where one had once been. No windows that I could see. A ripple of unease went through me. I had not passed the cabin on my way in. That much I was sure of, but here it stood, directly in my path. For a moment, curiosity outweighed caution. I stepped closer. Inside, the place was a ruin. Mold-blackened beams, a dirt floor littered with trash both old and new. Crushed cans, rusted metal scraps, torn cloth. Some of it looked decades old. Some looked recent. There was no sign of furniture, no sign of a purpose. But the longer I lingered, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. A damp chill settled over me despite the summer warmth. I turned back toward the trail, or what I thought was the trail, but froze when a sudden dull impact came from behind me. Not an animal, not a falling branch, a deliberate sound. I turned slowly. Through the open doorway, half hidden by shadow, stood a man. He was older, his hair wild and streaked with gray, his face weathered but blank of any readable emotion. His clothes were torn and filthy, hanging from his thin frame like rags. He did not speak. He simply stared at me. An icy fear rooted me in place. I managed to stammer a quiet apology, though why I felt the need to apologize, I could not say. Then I turned and walked quickly, too quickly, away from the cabin. I did not run. Some primal instinct warned me not to. For the next hour, as the sunlight began to fade into gold, then orange, then dusky purple, I searched for the trail. My pace was frantic, but my mind was sharp. I marked trees. I doubled back when needed. I scanned constantly for any movement behind me. I saw no sign of the man. Just before the last light died from the sky, I stumbled upon a more defined portion of the path. Relief flooded through me. I debated returning to my car, but exhaustion had crept into my bones. I did not want to risk losing the trail again in the dark. So I set up my tent in a small clearing near the trail. I skipped a fire. My nerves were too frayed. I secured my gear, climbed inside the tent, and lay down. Sleep came not from peace, but from sheer mental exhaustion. When I awoke, the world was black and the air inside the tent felt close and stale. At first, I thought it was a nightmare pulling me from sleep. Then I noticed the sound. No sound. The forest was utterly silent. No rustling leaves. No insects. No night birds. My eyes went to the zippered flap of the tent, which was partly open. And there, illuminated only by the faint silver light of the moon, was a face. The same man, his face poking through the gap in the tent. His eyes wide, his mouth shut tight, his head tilted slightly as though studying me like a curious predator. I recoiled, my heart crashing against my ribs. The man flinched as well, drawing back so swiftly he seemed to vanish into the darkness. I heard no footsteps, no fleeing sounds, just an oppressive stillness. Shaking uncontrollably, I grabbed my bag, tore down the tent in a frenzy, and forced myself to stay calm as I gathered everything. The trail was mercifully easy to follow in the moonlight. My adrenaline sharpened every sense. I walked without stopping, expecting at any moment to hear footsteps behind me or see movement in the shadows, but I never did. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the sky, I reached my car. My hands were so numb, I struggled to fit the key into the ignition. I drove away without looking back. In the months since, I have thought often of that man and the silent, decaying cabin deep in the forest. I do not know what he wanted. I only know that when he looked into my tent that night, he was not surprised to see me. It was as though he had been expecting me. And worse, I believe he would have returned again had I stayed through the night. A little over a year ago, I decided to take a short camping trip to a river not far from where my parents lived. I had grown up in a quiet, uneventful town in upstate New York, where the most excitement came from school football games or the occasional festival. But just beyond the town limits, there were miles and miles of quiet forest and winding rivers. I had spent much of my childhood exploring those woods with my dad, and now, as an adult, returning to them gave me a strange sense of calm. It was as though the forest had not changed, even though my life had. That summer, I had taken a few days off work to visit my parents. I stayed at their house for 2 days, helping with odd jobs around the property, before telling them I wanted to spend a night or two camping alone by the river. My dad offered to come along, but I assured him I would be fine. I wanted the solitude. The world had been too noisy lately, and my mind too restless. The trail I planned to use was one I had discovered years ago, a thin, mostly forgotten dirt path that wound along the riverbank. It was not marked on any of the official park maps. Most people preferred the broader, more scenic trails. That suited me just fine. That morning, I parked at the edge of the forest and loaded my backpack. It was heavier than it should have been, packed with extra supplies because I believed in being prepared. The hike took around 4 hours, moving at a steady pace. The forest was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional splash of water where the river curved near the trail. I did not see a single other person along the way. By the time I reached the riverbank, the sun was already low in the sky. The light filtering through the trees had turned soft and golden. I found a flat spot a few yards from the water's edge and pitched my tent. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Birds called softly from the treetops. For a while, as I set up my small campfire and prepared a simple meal, I felt the peacefulness I had been craving. But that peace did not last long. I was eating when I heard footsteps approaching, not the scrambling of an animal or the flutter of birds. Heavy, deliberate steps. I stood and turned, and after a long moment, a man emerged from the trees. He looked to be in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell. His face was unshaven, his hair a tangled mess beneath a faded ball cap. His clothes were dirty and worn. He had the look of someone who had been living rough in the woods for a while. Still, he smiled as he raised a hand in greeting. "Evening," he said. I nodded but said nothing. The man walked up to my campfire and squatted nearby, uninvited. He introduced himself as John and told me he had a camp not far downriver. He spoke casually, as though we were old friends. I answered his questions politely, but offered little in return. Something about him felt off. It was not just his appearance. It was the way he smiled without any warmth in his eyes. A smile that seemed rehearsed. We spoke for a few minutes. He asked where I had come from, how long I planned to stay, whether I had told anyone where I was camping. Simple questions, but the way he asked them made my skin crawl. Eventually, John stood, brushed the dirt from his pants, and said goodnight. He walked off toward the river with a small flashlight, its beam flickering between the trees. I watched until he was out of sight. Then, the light shut off. No footsteps, no rustling branches, just silence. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just another camper. Maybe he had turned off his flashlight to preserve the battery. But the timing had been too strange. He had appeared within minutes of me lighting the fire, as though he had been nearby, watching, waiting for the right moment to approach. I let the fire burn low. I stayed up until well past midnight, listening to every sound in the forest. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I retreated into my tent and lay down, my backpack near at hand and my knife tucked into the sleeping bag beside me. The night passed without incident. In the morning, I hiked further along the river, hoping the movement would clear my mind and ease my unease. The forest was bright and alive with morning bird song. I followed the river's curve for several miles, but saw no sign of any other camps. No tents, no smoke from fires, no gear left behind. Not even footprints in the muddy banks where John had supposedly set up camp. It was as though he had vanished. By the time the sun began its descent, I returned to my own camp, tired but slightly more at ease. Maybe he had packed up and moved on. That is when I saw him again. John was sitting by my fire pit, legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. The fire was unlit, just as I had left it. He had no gear with him, no backpack, no supplies. It was as though he had been waiting. He smiled the same hollow smile and stood. "Glad you're back," he said. "Found something downriver I thought you might want to see." I froze where I stood. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse. "I'm tired," I said carefully. "Think I'll stay here tonight." John's smile faded. His eyes narrowed, though he quickly forced the smile back. He repeated the invitation, urged me to follow him. I declined again. A long silence stretched between us. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine as though weighing my resolve. Finally, he turned and walked away. But as he moved, his shirt lifted slightly, revealing the butt of a small pistol tucked into the waistband of his pants. I had seen people carry firearms in the woods before, usually holstered properly at the hip or chest, not concealed like that, not hidden beneath a shirt. My blood went cold. As soon as he disappeared into the trees, I packed up. I left the tent, the cooking gear, even my sleeping bag. I grabbed only the essentials and started back along the trail. Night fell quickly. The forest became a tangle of shadows. I walked without stopping, flashlight gripped tightly in one hand, my knife in the other. Every few minutes, I paused to listen. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps paralleling mine in the dark, always distant, always just beyond the edge of the light. But I never saw him again. The return hike took over 4 hours, and by the time I reached my car, my legs were trembling from both fatigue and fear. I locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. My mind kept replaying John's words, his smile, the gun. And worst of all, the thought of what might have happened if I had followed him downriver that evening. I do not camp alone anymore, not because of wildlife, not because of the terrain, but because, in the wilderness, the most dangerous thing you can encounter is not nature. It is another person. It has been 3 years since the last camping trip I ever took with my best friend, a man I will call Nate for the sake of this telling. We had gone camping together since our college days, usually once or twice a year. Back then, it was easy to find time. Life was simple, but adulthood crept up on us, as it always does. Full-time jobs, relationships, responsibilities. Our once frequent trips had become rare. That summer, we managed to carve out 4 days. It was late August, and the air already carried a whisper of the approaching autumn. We chose a trail system in the Allegheny National Forest, somewhere between Kane and Sheffield, Pennsylvania. Remote enough to be quiet, but not so far off the beaten path that we would be completely isolated. At least, that was what we thought. Our plan was straightforward. Hike in about 2 hours, set up a base camp, and stay put for the duration of the trip. We were not interested in testing our limits. The whole point was to relax. No social media, no work calls. Just campfires, starlight, and conversation. The first 3 days unfolded exactly as we hoped. We set up the tents in a clearing near a cold, trickling creek. We gathered firewood, cooked simple meals, and spent long hours sitting by the fire. We took short walks along the nearby trails, played a few old board games Nate had brought along, and talked about everything and nothing. It felt like the old days. But on the 4th evening, things unraveled. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when Nate volunteered to gather some dry sticks for the fire. I agreed to start prepping dinner. We did not bring much, just some canned food and simple snacks, but the ritual of preparing a meal in the forest always felt grounding. Nate walked off with a canvas bag in hand. I watched him disappear down the trail and then went about my tasks. At first, I thought nothing of the time passing. Half an hour was not unusual for collecting firewood, especially if he wandered a little farther than usual. But when an hour had passed and night had fully descended, unease began to take root. I turned on our heavy-duty lantern, its beam cutting through the darkness, and waited. Another 30 minutes. No sign of Nate. That was when worry hardened into fear. Nate was the more experienced outdoorsman between us. He had been hiking and camping since he was a child. It made no sense for him to get lost so close to camp. I debated my options. I could head down the trail after him. But what if he returned while I was gone? What if I got lost myself? The rational part of my mind told me to stay put. Instead, I gathered some sticks myself and built up the campfire. If Nate was trying to find his way back, the firelight would serve as a beacon. 2 hours had passed since he had left, then 2.5. The forest had grown oppressively silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional chirp of night insects. That was when I heard it, a single gunshot. It echoed from somewhere deep in the direction Nate had gone. Neither of us had brought a gun. We never did. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Every scenario flashed through my mind. Had Nate encountered a dangerous animal? A bear or a coyote? Or worse, another person? Panic warred with reason. I grabbed the lantern and started down the trail, my every nerve screaming against the darkness. It was not long before I heard footsteps, running, fast and frantic. I held up the lantern, its narrow beam shaking wildly in my trembling hands. a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Nate. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. I had never seen fear like that on another human being, not in real life. He rushed up to me and seized my arm. His voice came in a sharp, breathless whisper. "We need to go, now." I did not ask questions. His urgency, the raw terror in his eyes, told me all I needed to know. We ran back to the camp, tore down what gear we could manage, and stuffed only the essentials into our backpacks. We left the tent and everything else behind. As we moved, I tried to ask what had happened. Nate refused to speak. He kept looking back over his shoulder, as though expecting something or someone to appear out of the trees. We hiked for hours in the dark, following the trail back toward the road where our car waited. Not once did Nate speak of the gunshot. Not once did he explain what had happened. It was not until we had reached the safety of the vehicle and were driving away that he finally said anything. In a low, hollow voice, he told me that while collecting firewood, he had encountered a man. The man had stepped out of the trees with a gun raised, ordering Nate to stay quiet and follow him. Nate complied at first, trying to remain calm. He was led deeper into the forest, away from the trail, away from any familiar landmarks. The man's face was covered in dirt, his clothes ragged. He spoke little, only giving sharp commands. Nate could tell the man was leading him somewhere bad. When they reached a small clearing, Nate saw what he thought was an old structure in the shadows, a shed or a cabin. He knew, instinctively, that if he was taken inside, he would never come out again. So he waited until the man was momentarily distracted, then lunged. They struggled. The gun went off. Nate managed to wrestle free and flee into the darkness, using the sound of the shot to mask his retreat. That was all he told me. Even now, years later, he refuses to elaborate. I have asked, of course, again and again, but every time, he shuts down. I suspect there is more to the story. Much more. Perhaps he overpowered the man. Perhaps the gunshot was not random. Perhaps that is why no one pursued us that night. But I will never know for certain. After that trip, Nate never went camping again. Neither did I. Some scars are not physical. Some fears settle into the soul like rot into wood. And when I think back to that night, the gunshot, Nate's haunted eyes, the silent forest swallowing us whole, I know that whatever happened out there was not a random encounter. It was something darker, something that, by sheer luck or desperation, we narrowly escaped. 4 years ago, I took my old RV into the woods behind my house for what I thought would be a quiet weekend alone. It was not my first time. The RV itself was a piece of junk, truth be told. I had bought it cheap from a retired couple who assured me it still ran but had seen better days. That was fine by me. I was not driving it across the country. I just needed something to carry me a few miles down the dirt trails winding through the forest that bordered my property. It had become a kind of tradition. Once or twice a month, when the weather allowed, I would take the RV a mile or two into the woods, park in a small clearing I had cleared out years before, and camp out for a night or two. It was my way of escaping the world. No phones, no neighbors, no streetlights. Just trees and sky and the soft sounds of nature. That September weekend started no differently. I loaded the RV with supplies early on a Friday morning. A small cooler of food and drinks, a few books, some tools, my camping chair, and of course, my old Smith & Wesson revolver, which I kept locked in a secure compartment. I had never needed it, but being alone in the forest, it gave me a little peace of mind. I drove the RV down the familiar dirt trail, tires crunching softly over dry leaves and packed earth. The trees arched overhead, their leaves just beginning to show the first signs of autumn color. After about a mile and a half, I pulled off into my usual clearing. The ground was flat, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. Close enough to a small creek for easy water access, but far enough from any public trails that I rarely, if ever, saw another person. I set up camp, unfolded my chair, and built a small fire pit using the stones I kept piled nearby. By late afternoon, I was settled in. I spent the day reading, walking the perimeter, and enjoying the quiet. As evening approached, I added more wood to the fire and watched the sun dip below the treetops. The sky turned a soft pink, then deep purple, before the stars blinked awake overhead. It was then, just after darkness fully settled, that I heard it. Footsteps. Not the scurry of animals or the random creaks and groans of the forest. Human footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I sat frozen in my chair, my ears straining. The sounds came from beyond the fire's reach, out in the trees to my left. Someone or something was circling the camp. I stood up quietly, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it into the dark. The beam cut through the night, revealing only trees and undergrowth. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I convinced myself it had been an animal after all. A deer, maybe. Something my imagination had exaggerated. Still, the unease lingered. I doused the fire, gathered my belongings, and retreated into the RV. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps returned about 20 minutes later. This time, they did not circle. They stopped near the front of the RV. I peered cautiously through a small crack in the curtain. The moon cast a faint silver glow across the clearing, but I saw no one. The footsteps moved again, slowly walking around the RV, crunching leaves beneath steady, measured steps. Then they stopped, and the silence returned. I stayed awake for hours, clutching my revolver, every nerve on edge. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, though I slept fitfully. Morning came without further incident. The forest was bright and alive again, birds singing as though the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. There were no obvious footprints. The earth was too dry, the leaves too thick. Still, the unease from the night before had not vanished. I spent the morning debating whether to pack up and leave or stay another night. In the end, stubbornness, or perhaps foolishness, won out. I told myself it had been nothing. Just nerves. Just the isolation playing tricks on me. That afternoon passed quietly. I hiked a short trail nearby, always keeping the RV in sight. I found no sign of anyone else in the area. As the sun set once more, I rebuilt the fire and tried to relax. The night air was cool and crisp. A light breeze rustled the treetops. For a while, it almost felt normal again. Then I saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. 20, maybe 30 feet away. A man. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dark jacket and jeans. His face was shadowed. He did not move, did not speak, just stood there, watching. I rose slowly, heart hammering, and grabbed my flashlight. But before I could turn it on, the man stepped back into the trees and vanished. No sound, no trace. I did not bother finishing my drink or adding more wood to the fire. I gathered everything from outside and locked myself in the RV again. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I sat in the dark, revolver in hand, flashlight nearby. At some point, fatigue must have overtaken me, because I awoke to the sound of footsteps once more. But this time, they were running. The footsteps approached rapidly, pounding against the forest floor. They reached the RV's door, then stopped. For a long, breathless moment, I heard nothing. Then the footsteps moved again, circling the RV, faster this time. Once, twice. Then they retreated into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up. The RV rumbled to life, and I drove out of the clearing without looking back. Back at home, I filed a report with the local sheriff. They said they would send someone to check the area, but I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I do not know who that man was or what he wanted, but I have a feeling he had been watching me long before I ever saw him. And if I had stayed another night, I doubt I would be here to tell this story. 5 years ago, during the early days of October, I set out alone what was supposed to be a simple 3-day backpacking trip along a lesser-known trail system in the northern Appalachians. By that point, I was no stranger to hiking and camping. I had spent most of my 20s exploring forests all along the eastern states, from the Adirondacks to Shenandoah. I knew how to navigate. I knew how to prepare. I knew how to respect the unpredictability of the wilderness. At least, I thought I did. The trail I chose that season was relatively obscure. I had pieced together a route based on online forums and a few old hiking guidebooks. It wasn't an official recreational trail marked by park rangers or maintained by volunteers. It was more like a collection of old paths, logging roads, and deer trails, stitched together by ambitious backpackers looking for solitude. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I planned a 3-day hike. My gear was carefully packed. A reliable compass, a laminated topographical map, enough food and water filtration equipment to last longer than I intended to stay, just in case. Day 1 was uneventful. The trail started wide and welcoming, its path covered in golden leaves fallen from the early autumn trees. Birds sang overhead. A cool breeze stirred the branches. I moved confidently, following the landmarks I had noted in my research. By midday on the second day, things changed. The trail narrowed. Trees pressed closer together. The ground became uneven, patches of moss and root tangling the path. Still, I felt no concern. According to my map, this was expected. The route became more challenging before opening up again, near a ridge that would serve as a clear landmark for my second night's campsite. But as the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I realized something was wrong. The trail beneath my boots began to vanish. What had once been a clear, if narrow, path became a patchwork of broken undergrowth and deer tracks. I checked my compass. The direction seemed correct. I double-checked my notes. Everything matched. Yet the forest felt unfamiliar. The further I walked, the less certain I became. Trees that should have been recognizable landmarks appeared alien. The faint trail beneath me seemed to curve in subtle, unsettling ways, as though leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. By late afternoon, I accepted the truth. I was no longer on the right trail. I could have turned back then, retraced my steps. But after hours of walking, the idea of backtracking through the same dense, confusing forest felt riskier than pushing forward to find clearer ground. So I pressed on, promising myself I would stop and make camp before darkness fully settled. That was when I saw it. Through the trees ahead, past a small rise, an orange glow flickered. A campfire. Relief washed over me. I was not alone out here. Maybe another hiker had wandered off course like I had. We could compare maps, figure out where things had gone wrong. I approached cautiously, calling out a greeting. No reply. As I crested the rise, the fire came into view. But what I saw was not what I expected. The fire burned low, casting light on a crude clearing surrounded by scattered gear. Tents, backpacks, sleeping bags, all piled in a haphazard ring around the fire. And beyond the clearing stood a small hut or cabin, if it could be called that. Its walls were rough-cut timber, patched together with sheets of metal and plastic. The roof sagged beneath a heavy layer of moss. The door hung open. I stepped closer, heart pounding. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. The scattered gear was not from a single camper. It was a collection. Some of the equipment was brand new, tags still attached. Other pieces were worn, faded, or torn. Different brands, different sizes. Too many items for one person or even one group to reasonably carry. Inside the hut, the same pattern repeated. More gear. Dozens of backpacks, sleeping bags, tents, boots, hiking poles leaning in a corner. A lantern with a cracked glass cover. The air inside smelled musty, damp, with an undercurrent of something sour and old. But what chilled me most was the disorder. The way the items were tossed together as though taken, not gathered. I backed out of the hut, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The fire was burning, but there was no sign of anyone tending it. No voices, no movement. And then, as I turned to leave, the fire dimmed, snuffed out, not by the breeze, not from lack of fuel. Someone had extinguished it. Panic surged through me. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and scanned the clearing. The beam illuminated trees, undergrowth, the piled gear, but no people. I listened, breath held. Nothing. Not even the normal sounds of the forest. No birds. No insects. The oppressive stillness of an empty, waiting place. I did not run. Something told me that would draw attention. Instead, I walked swiftly but quietly back toward the way I had come, flashlight off, moving by moonlight. The forest seemed unfamiliar, twisted into strange shapes by shadows and fear. But after nearly an hour of careful progress, I found a boulder I recognized from earlier that day. Relief almost overwhelmed me. From there, I followed the faint memory of the path until it rejoined the trail I had started on. I did not stop. I hiked through the night without pause, driven by the primal need to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. By late morning, I emerged from the forest, exhausted but safe. I reported what I had found to the local authorities, rangers, police. They listened politely, took notes, promised to look into it. Weeks passed with no updates. Months later, I followed up. No one had found the hut. No gear. No signs of the fire or the clearing. As though it had never existed. But I know what I saw. I believe someone, or some group, had been leading hikers off the main trails, luring them into that part of the forest, stealing their gear. And maybe worse, I escaped because I arrived at the wrong time. Or the right time. Because the fire was still burning. Because whoever had been there had not yet returned. I have never set foot in those woods again. And I never will. When I was 9 years old, my family went on a camping trip that has stayed with me for all the wrong reasons. It was an annual tradition. Every summer, we would leave behind the dusty Arizona suburbs and drive north to Washington State. My relatives lived there, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and we would gather at a wooded campground near a small lake. As a kid, it was paradise. Towering trees, cool breezes, the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Even the rainy days felt like a novelty compared to the scorching, dry heat of home. But it was not just the forest that excited me. It was the people. My cousins and I were close. None closer than Luis. Luis was a year older than me, and in many ways, more like a brother than a cousin. We spent every possible moment together when our families met up. He was fearless, or at least that was how I saw him then. That summer, things started the way they always did. Our family set up a cluster of tents near the lake. Adults gathered around the fire pit, drinking coffee and chatting. Some went swimming. Others cooked or lounged in folding chairs with books. Luis and I, restless and full of energy, chose to explore the woods. We had invented a game we called Bandit. One of us was the outlaw, the other the sheriff. The sheriff had to chase down the bandit and tag them before they could hide or escape. That day, I was the bandit. Luis grabbed a fallen tree branch, pretending it was a rifle, and gave me a head start. I ran. The trees blurred past me. Branches whipped against my arms. My breath came in short, excited gasps. I should have stayed close to camp. That was the rule. But in the rush of the game, in the desire to win, I kept running. When I finally stopped, I was deep in the woods. Luz's footsteps faded behind me. I turned, expecting to see him burst from the undergrowth. Instead, I saw an old trailer. It sat crookedly between two trees, its metal sides rusted and streaked with grime. The windows were dark. The door hung slightly open. Luis appeared moments later, dropping his makeshift rifle. His expression shifted from playful to curious. "We should check it out," I said. Luis frowned. For once, he hesitated. "Maybe we should just go back." That hesitation saved us. We turned away from the trailer and started walking, though neither of us really knew which direction would take us back to camp. About 10 minutes into our uncertain journey, we spotted movement ahead. A man and a woman emerged from the trees, pushing a rusty shopping cart piled high with odds and ends. Metal scraps, old blankets, random tools. The woman smiled warmly. She had frizzy gray hair and wore a stained blue jacket. The man hung back, silent, his face unreadable beneath a tattered hat. "Are you two lost?" the woman asked. Her voice was soft, almost musical. "We can help." Luis and I exchanged a nervous glance. We nodded slowly. She asked our names, our ages, who we were camping with. When we told her we were 9 and 10, something in her expression shifted. She glanced back at the man, who gave a barely perceptible nod. "You don't have to be scared," she said. "We'll get you back to your family after we drop our things off." We were just about to make s'mores. Do you like s'mores? At the mention of treats, some of my fear dissolved. She seemed nice. It was daytime. Bad people did bad things at night, or so my child's mind reasoned. We followed them. As we walked, the woman chatted pleasantly, asking us harmless questions. Luis answered cautiously. I stayed mostly silent. I noticed the contents of the cart more clearly now. Not camping supplies, not groceries, just junk, rusted metal, pieces of machinery, broken appliances. Nothing that made sense for a campsite, and the man never smiled, never spoke. He stared ahead, only occasionally glancing at us. When he did, his eyes were flat and cold. I felt unease creeping back into my stomach. After a while, the trailer came into view again. The woman squeezed my hand gently. "Almost there," she said. "Then s'mores." But before we reached the trailer, a voice echoed through the trees. "Luis!" Another voice followed. My name. It was my older sister. The woman's grip tightened. She looked at the man. Something passed between them in silence. The man muttered something too low for me to hear. The woman turned us sharply toward the trailer, urging us to hurry. Her hand clamped around mine painfully now, no longer gentle. Panic rose in my chest. Then I saw my sister, pushing through the undergrowth, calling again. She looked frantic. Without thinking, I shouted her name. The woman's grip vanished. Luis and I bolted toward my sister. She wrapped her arms around us, pulling us close. Moments later, my parents and uncle arrived, drawn by the shouting. The couple approached, smiling calmly as though nothing were amiss. They spun a story about finding us lost in the woods and searching for our parents. They spoke sweetly, laughing off any concerns. My parents were grateful at the time. They even offered to share our dinner with the couple as thanks. The woman politely declined. The man never spoke a word. That night, Louise and I told my sister about how strange the couple had seemed, how they had tried to take us to the trailer. She listened but did not fully grasp the seriousness. It wasn't until years later, when Louise and I were old enough to understand, that the full horror of what nearly happened sank in. They were not helping us. They were taking us. To this day, I believe they had plans for us that went far beyond making s'mores. Whether it was to traffic us, harm us, or something else entirely, I can only guess. What haunts me most is the memory of that man's eyes. Cold, empty, calculating. If my sister had not called our names when she bid, I am almost certain neither Louise nor I would have ever been seen again. We were lucky. Luckier than we ever deserved to be. And that old trailer? When I returned to that campground as an adult, it was gone. No trace of it remained. Just trees. And shadows. It has been years now, but I still think about that spring camping trip. Sometimes I think about it every night when I try to sleep. At the time, I was 20 and attending college in northern Michigan. My friend, let's call him Tyler, was someone I had met through a hiking club on campus. He and I bonded over a shared love of the outdoors, especially the solitude of forests far from town and people. Both of us had experience hiking. Neither of us had experience spending a full night out in the wild. That was the next step. We talked about it for weeks, planning carefully, wanting to do it right. We picked the trail we both knew well, one that wound deep into the Huron-Manistee National Forest. It was quiet, beautiful, and remote. That was important to us. We wanted isolation. Not just to challenge ourselves, but because the quiet felt like a kind of therapy after the pressures of school and city life. We loaded our backpacks with everything we thought we'd need. Tent, food, water filters, extra clothes, a portable lantern, maps, compass, even a small first aid kit. We were determined not to be the kind of careless hikers who made news headlines. We arrived late in the morning and started the 6-mile hike into the forest. As expected, we saw no one else. This trail was off the radar for most campers. It was not marked by the Park Service anymore. That was part of its appeal. By late afternoon, we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a patch of grass bordered by tall birch and pine, not far from a small stream. The trees around us were dense enough to muffle the outside world entirely. The only sounds were the breeze and the birds. We pitched our tents side by side and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped low, we gathered fallen branches and built a fire. Tyler had brought a 6-pack of cheap beer. Probably not the most responsible choice for first-time campers, but neither of us planned to get drunk. We each had one, sitting by the fire, laughing quietly at how seriously we prepared. The hours slipped by. Eventually, we put out the fire and retreated to our tents. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the steady sounds of the forest at night. But sleep did not last. I woke several times, not from any particular sound or disturbance. I would just snap awake, heart racing, for no clear reason. Each time, I told myself it was nerves, nothing more. My mind adjusting to the unfamiliar setting. On what must have been the 4th or 5th time, I heard the sound of Tyler's tent zipper. Soft, deliberate. I thought he was stepping out to relieve himself. Normal enough, but instead of moving away, his footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then I heard rustling, the distinct sound of a backpack being opened and rummaged through. 30 seconds passed. No more movement. Just the sound of something being searched or held. A strange primal unease washed over me. Finally, curiosity and caution overcame me. I sat up and slowly unzipped my tent flap. The sound of my zipper must have alerted him. I heard his footsteps retreat quickly into the shadows. When I poked my head out, I saw him crouched near his backpack, hastily shoving something inside. He froze when he saw me looking at him. His expression was not embarrassed, not sheepish. It was calculating, almost cold. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice steady but cautious. He nodded after a pause. "Couldn't sleep, just getting some air." His answer was too smooth, too rehearsed. As he spoke, my eyes fell on the backpack he was closing. For a moment, I caught sight of metal protruding from the top, partially hidden beneath his clothes and gear. The back end of a handgun. I felt my stomach twist. We had both agreed there was no need to bring weapons. We had specifically talked about it before the trip. Neither of us owned firearms. Or so I had thought. My reaction must have been too slow. Tyler noticed where I was looking. We locked eyes for a long, tense moment. Then, without another word, he climbed back into his tent. I sat outside, mind racing, trying to reason through what I had seen. Why he would have hidden a gun. Why he would lie. None of the explanations I came up with made me feel better. That night, I did not sleep. I sat fully dressed, my flashlight in one hand, the camping knife in the other. My gaze never left Tyler's tent. He made no more sounds. When dawn broke, pale light filtering through the canopy, I packed up my gear swiftly and efficiently. Tyler emerged from his tent, acting casual, as though nothing had happened. I told him I was heading back. I did not give a reason. To my surprise, he did not argue. He simply nodded. That was the last time I ever saw him. He never texted or called me after the trip. Never came back to the hiking club. It was as if he had vanished from my life completely. For a while, I told myself maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe he had bought the gun recently for protection and felt embarrassed admitting it. Maybe he had not meant any harm. But that did not explain why he hid it. Why he searched through his gear in the dark. Why he stood silently outside my tent for those long seconds before I caught him. And why, when our eyes met, his face did not show surprise or guilt, only calculation. Even now, years later, when I go hiking, I prefer crowded trails. Trails where there are always other people nearby. Because what I learned that night is a truth too many outdoorsmen forget. Nature itself is not what you should fear. It is the company you choose, and the company you cannot see coming. In the fall of 2019, I took what was supposed to be a week-long solo backpacking trip across the lower reaches of the Appalachian Range. It was a tradition I had started years before with my best friend, Ryan. Every autumn, we would pick a trail that tested us. We would spend days trekking through the wilderness, carrying only what we could shoulder, camping under the stars, drinking crisp mountain water from clear streams. But that year, Ryan had to back out at the last minute, a family emergency. I had already booked time off work. My pack was loaded. I told myself it was fine. I could do it alone. I had done other solo hikes before. The trail I chose was a challenging one, marked only by natural features and old hiker notations. No rangers, no crowds, just me and the forest. My ultimate goal was a small glacial lake near a ridgeline, known only to locals and adventurous backpackers. The first 2 days went smoothly. The path wound through dense woods, crossing small streams and climbing gradual slopes. I used my compass and map religiously, checking my course every hour. That second evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, I made camp near a small grove. The trees swayed gently in the wind. I cooked a simple meal, recorded a few notes in my journal, and drifted into sleep with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves lulling me. But sometime after midnight, I woke suddenly. No sound, no breeze. Just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. For a moment, I thought I had imagined whatever had disturbed me. Then I heard it. A sharp crack of a branch snapping behind my tent. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. My first thought was a bear. They were known in these parts, though rarely aggressive unless provoked. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. The beam cut into the darkness beyond. Trees. Fallen leaves. Nothing more. I stepped out slowly, calling out sharply in hopes of scaring off whatever might be lurking nearby. No response. No retreating footsteps. It was odd, but not enough to panic me. I stayed awake for another hour, scanning the forest before returning to my tent. The morning brought no further signs of intruders, animal or otherwise. I packed up and continued my hike. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge. From there, the lake stretched out below me like a hidden jewel, its surface dark and still beneath the towering peaks. It was beautiful, isolated, exactly what I had come for. I descended and circled the lake shore, searching for a good campsite. There was no one else. No tents, no smoke, no footprints. Or so I thought. I set up my tent near the tree line, cooked a modest dinner, and sat watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky deepened to black. But as darkness settled fully, I began hearing soft, almost rhythmic noises. Footsteps. I turned off my lantern and listened closely. The steps seemed to circle the lake, slow and deliberate. Too even to be an animal. For the next hour, they would stop and start. Always faint, always just beyond sight. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was projecting my earlier fear into the sounds of normal forest life. Eventually, I climbed into my tent and lay down, knife tucked under my pillow, just in case. Sleep came slowly, and when it did not last. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of something or someone running. The steps were heavy, frantic, crashing through the leaves just beyond the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. The beam caught a figure sprinting into the trees. Whoever it was, they were barefoot and shirtless, disappearing into the darkness with alarming speed. When I stepped outside, I froze. There were footprints all around my tent, dozens of them, overlapping, as though someone had spent hours circling the camp. My campfire had been carefully scattered, not extinguished haphazardly, but spread deliberately to prevent relighting. I felt a cold dread settle into my bones. This was no prank, no coincidence. Someone had been stalking me, watching me, and worse, they had entered the campsite without fear, with purpose. I rebuilt the fire quickly, keeping it bright and tall, and sat beside it with my knife drawn and my flashlight ready. The rest of the night was mercifully quiet, though every rustling branch and falling leaf set my nerves on edge. At first light, I packed everything at a frantic pace. I had planned to stay by the lake for another day. That plan was abandoned without a second thought. The hike back was long, longer than it should have been, because I chose a different route, unwilling to pass the same ground where I had camped. And during that hike, I noticed things missing from my pack. Small things, a few tools, a sealed food pouch. At the time, I thought perhaps I had misplaced them, but now, I wonder if that figure had not just scattered my fire, but also searched my belongings while I slept. That thought chills me even more than the footprints. When I finally emerged from the forest, exhausted and anxious, I reported what I had seen to the local ranger station. They listened carefully, asked questions, and promised to send someone to investigate. Weeks later, they followed up. No evidence had been found. No footprints. No disturbed campsites. Just a silent forest. To this day, I wonder who that person was, and what might have happened if I had not woken when I did. 2 summers ago, I decided it was time to finally try camping alone. I had grown up in Oregon, where my family owned a collection of small cabins deep in the woods near the Umpqua National Forest. They were simple structures, built decades ago by my grandfather and his brothers. Over time, they had become a gathering place for family reunions, weekend retreats, and hunting trips. But lately, no one really used them anymore. My cousins had moved out of state. My parents were getting older. The idea of solo camping had been on my mind for a while. Most of my trips before had been with friends or family. But that year, I had turned 20 and felt like proving to myself that I could manage on my own. The cabins, I figured, were the perfect place to start. Familiar territory, yet remote enough to feel like a real wilderness experience. I loaded my gear into my car and drove the familiar hour-long route into the forest. The road narrowed as it wound deeper between towering evergreens. At the final fork, I turned onto the rough trail that led to the cabins. There were 3 in total, spaced about 100 yards apart. all wooden, with tin roofs and porches that sagged a little more each year. I chose the middle cabin, which had always been my favorite as a kid. It had a big front window that overlooked a small clearing and a sturdy wood stove inside. But when I pulled up, I noticed something immediately. The window was gone. Not broken, not shattered. Gone. The entire glass pane had been removed from its frame. No shards on the ground. No obvious signs of damage. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. I had brought a key to the cabin, not expecting to need it, since no one locked these doors in the past. But as I approached, I saw that the front door was ajar. I pushed it open. The inside smelled of damp wood and mildew. Muddy footprints streaked across the floor. Some furniture was missing. A few kitchen items were gone. A box of old hunting gear had been rifled through, its contents scattered. It was clear someone had been here, but there was no way of knowing when. Months could have passed since the last family visit. Whoever broke in might be long gone. I hesitated, considering whether to stay or drive back home. In the end, I decided to continue with my plan. After all, I was not planning to sleep inside the cabin. I wanted to camp in the woods nearby. I locked the cabin door the best I could with a length of rope and a wooden wedge, then gathered my pack and walked about half a mile down the hill to a flat spot beside a cluster of birch trees. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I spent the next 2 hours setting up my tent and rain tarp, fumbling awkwardly as the first drops began to fall. By the time everything was ready, I was soaked but proud of my effort. I sat beneath the tarp, eating a cold meal from my pack, listening to the steady drum of rain on the canvas. That was when I heard it. A voice. Faint, murmuring. I turned quickly and spotted a man walking through the trees behind me. He was soaked to the skin, his jacket hanging limp, his head bowed slightly as he spoke to himself. I could not make out the words. He was heading uphill, toward the cabins. I stayed perfectly still, hoping he had not seen me. The man disappeared into the trees. For a long time, I heard nothing else but rain. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and hiked back up the hill to the cabin. From a distance, it still looked empty. No lights, no movement. I returned to my campsite, heart still pounding, but telling myself that the man was probably just a hiker or someone living rough in the woods. As night fell, I built a small fire beneath the tarp and tried to relax. But the forest felt different now. Every snap of a branch or gust of wind seemed unnaturally loud. Then, just as I was about to retreat to my tent, footsteps approached from uphill. Slow, steady. A figure appeared in the gloom. It was the same man. He stepped into the edge of the firelight. His clothes were filthy, his hair plastered to his forehead by rain. His face was gaunt and blank. He did not speak. I rose to my feet and called out firmly, asking what he wanted. The man stared at me, unmoving, water dripping from his jacket. I repeated myself, louder this time. No response. For a long moment, we just stood there, the fire crackling between us. Then I heard it, a single footstep behind me. Another person. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack and sprinted sideways into the darkness, away from the firelight. I ran downhill, heart hammering, not daring to look back. The rain masked the sound of pursuit, if there was any. Eventually, my legs gave out. I crouched behind a fallen log, flashlight off, waiting. Nothing followed. I circled wide, finding the old trail that led back to the main road. I walked for nearly an hour, soaked and shaking, until I reached my car. Once I had signal, I called the police. In the following days, they searched the area. My campsite was abandoned. The cabin still showed signs of forced entry, and 3 distinct sets of footprints were found in the mud around the clearing. 3 people, but no suspects were ever identified. No arrests made. I do not know what those men had planned, but I know without a doubt that staying in that forest another night would have ended very differently. I have not returned to those cabins since, and I never will. I was 28 when I decided to try camping alone for the first time. Until then, every hiking or camping trip I had taken had been with others. Friends, family, sometimes organized groups. I had always preferred company in the woods. It made the long hours on the trail more bearable, and it kept my mind from wandering into darker thoughts when night fell and the world grew quiet. But that spring, something in me changed. I found myself craving solitude. I wanted to disconnect from everything. No emails, no texts, no responsibilities, just nature and my own thoughts. So I chose a small, secluded forest preserve in southern Illinois. It was not exactly rugged wilderness, but it was remote enough. The land was flat, covered in hardwood trees, with a few winding trails and a shallow pond at the end of one of them. I figured it would be the perfect starting point. Not too challenging, but isolated enough to give me the feeling of true independence. The hiking was short, under an hour at a relaxed pace. The pond itself was unremarkable. Small, its shoreline marshy in places. No defined landmarks. Just reeds, low grass, and the trees pressing close on all sides. I pitched my tent a good distance from the water, finding a patch of dry ground beneath a cluster of old maples. By late afternoon, I had my camp set up. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. Birds flitted overhead. Somewhere, frogs croaked softly in the reeds. It was peaceful, almost boring. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I walked the perimeter of the pond, exploring. There were no other campers. No footprints, no litter, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. I returned to my camp, gathered some kindling, and used my small fire starter to light a modest fire. As night fell, the forest came alive with the usual sounds of evening. Crickets, owls, the occasional splash from the pond. But then, just after the last light faded from the sky, I noticed something across the water. A glow. At first, I thought it might be a distant campfire, though it was far too bright and steady. The light flickered slightly, as though moving among the trees on the far shore. It struck me as odd. There had been no sign of other campers, and the ground on that side of the pond was swampy, not ideal for a campsite. I told myself it was probably a hiker with a flashlight, maybe a fisherman who had stayed out later than expected. Still, I kept glancing at it as I ate my meal by the fire. The light remained steady for nearly an hour, occasionally bobbing or shifting slightly, though it never drew closer. Then, without warning, it dimmed and went out. The forest seemed to grow quieter in its absence. I stared at the now empty shoreline, unease prickling the back of my neck, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I retreated to my tent, leaving the fire to burn low. I slept fitfully, my dreams restless and fragmented. When dawn arrived, I woke early, the forest still heavy with morning mist. Despite my lingering unease, I decided to investigate the area where I had seen the light. Curiosity overpowered caution. I crossed around the pond carefully, navigating the muddy ground and low brush. It did not take long to find the flashlight. It lay half hidden in the grass, sleek and new, its batteries drained. No other gear, no footprints, no signs of a camp. The strangeness of it unsettled me. Who had left it? And why had there been no other trace of their presence? I left the flashlight where I found it and made my way back to camp. But when I arrived, my blood ran cold. Two men stood beside my fire pit. They wore dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them rifled through my gear, while the other stood motionless, scanning the surrounding trees, scanning for me. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding. I dared not move or call out. Then the second man stopped and turned toward the pond, toward me. Even at that distance, I could tell he had spotted me. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the water. Then he motioned to the other man, who immediately abandoned the search of my gear and followed. Both began walking swiftly around the pond, heading in my direction. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran. I did not follow the trail back to my car. That would have made me easy to track. Instead, I plunged deeper into the forest, moving fast and silent, using every bit of hiking experience I had to stay ahead. I listened carefully, but the soft ground and morning mist masked the sounds of pursuit. 15 minutes passed before I dared to slow down. Eventually, I circled back in the general direction of the road. It took nearly an hour, but I emerged safely at the trailhead where my car was parked. No sign of the men. No sign that they had followed me that far. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. They took my statement seriously, sending a team back to the pond. But when they arrived, my camp had been stripped clean. No gear, no footprints, no flashlight. As if no one had ever been there at all. The rangers filed a report, but no suspects were ever found. No arrests made. Some nights, when sleep refuses to come, I think about that flashlight. Had it really been a careless hiker's lost tool? Or had it been left intentionally to lure me away from camp? A simple trap. And if I had stayed at the camp, would they have waited until nightfall to approach? Or would they have come sooner? The forest, I realized, holds more dangers than just wild animals or sudden weather. Sometimes the greatest threat comes not from nature itself, but from the things that hide within it. It happened last spring on what I thought would be a peaceful weekend hike through a stretch of quiet forest land about 2 hours north of where I lived. I had always preferred hiking alone. No small talk, no waiting for others to catch up. Just me and the trail and the endless rhythm of footsteps over earth and stone. That weekend, I chose a new trail. A 4-mile loop that wound through a stretch of mixed pine and hardwood, gradually climbing toward a ridgeline before descending back to the starting point. It wasn't a marked or popular trail. That was the appeal. Solitude. Silence. The first 45 minutes were uneventful. I moved at a relaxed pace, enjoying the mild breeze and the soft crunch of last year's leaves beneath my boots. That was when I saw it. Just off the side of the trail, hidden among the trees, was a tent. It was sagging, weathered, and streaked with dirt and green moss. From a distance, it looked abandoned. I paused and studied it carefully. There were no signs of recent use. No smoke from a fire. No gear scattered about. The fabric was torn in several places, but it still stood upright, held together by sheer stubbornness or luck. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail and approached. Peering inside, I found nothing. No sleeping bag, no food wrappers, no equipment. Just the hollow, musty-smelling shell of a tent long forgotten. It was strange, but not entirely unheard of. Sometimes, campers left behind gear they no longer wanted or couldn't carry. Still, something about it unsettled me. I returned to the trail and continued on. As the hike stretched into its second hour, I began noticing other things. First, a rusted camping stove half buried in the undergrowth. Then a single hiking boot, its sole torn and peeling away. Further along, a broken walking stick, snapped clean in half. Piece by piece, scattered along the trail like breadcrumbs. All of it old, all of it abandoned, and all of it from different brands, different time periods. It wasn't as if someone had dropped these items recently. They had been left behind over years, maybe decades. A chill crept down my spine. It felt as if I was walking through the remnants of other people's lives. People who had come here before me. I tried to shake off the feeling. By late afternoon, I reached the far end of the trail where I planned to set up camp. I found a spot well away from the path, beneath a stand of tall pines. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the whisper of wind in the branches. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and built a small fire. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, I ate a simple meal and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. It was then, as darkness gathered, that I felt the first twinge of unease. The forest had grown too quiet. No birds, no insects, just a faint rustle of leaves far off in the trees. I convinced myself it was nothing, until I stepped out of the firelight and saw him. A man, standing on the far side of my tent just a few feet away. He was tall and thin, wearing tattered clothes streaked with mud and grime. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and expressionless. He stared at me without speaking. I froze. "Leave," he said softly. His voice was raspy but calm. I nodded instinctively, words catching in my throat. I gathered my backpack slowly, not wanting to provoke him. But as soon as I moved, the man lunged forward. I stumbled back, repeating the word "okay" over and over, my voice trembling. He stopped inches from me, still staring. "Leave," he repeated. I understood now that this was no warning. It was a demand. I grabbed my pack and retreated into the trees, my heart racing. I did not run. Running felt like a mistake. I walked swiftly, staying off the trail, moving parallel to it as best I could. I glanced back once. The man stood by my abandoned tent, rummaging through my gear like an animal searching for food. I didn't stop to see what he would do next. I kept moving, navigating by moonlight and memory. The return hike was a blur of shadows and fear. Every snapping twig, every rustling branch sent adrenaline surging through me. At last, I reached the trailhead where my car sat waiting. I drove until I had cell signal and called the local sheriff's department. They took my report seriously. Officers and rangers searched the area in the following days. They found my tent torn apart and scattered. Most of my belongings were missing. Nearby, they discovered other abandoned items: a cooking pot, a flashlight, several old, weathered backpacks, and footprints. Multiple sets, leading away from the campsite and deeper into the woods. But no sign of the man. When they ran my story through their records, a deputy told me quietly that a nearly identical case had been reported 2 years earlier. A lone hiker had been driven from the trail by a thin, filthy man who said the same thing: "Leave." That hiker had also abandoned their gear and fled. No arrests had ever been made. No suspects identified. In the end, the officials chalked it up to a vagrant or a mentally unstable hermit living off the land. But that explanation never sat right with me. If he was living off the land, why had he never been found? Why were there so many discarded belongings along the trail? And why, after all these years, was he still there, still waiting, still watching, still telling people to leave? When I was 16, my family's house backed up to a vast forest that seemed endless to me and my friends. As kids, we spent countless days out there, building forts, playing hide and seek, pretending to be explorers. The forest became our private world, a place where imagination could run wild, and the dangers of the adult world felt distant and unimportant. But as we grew older, the games faded. By high school, my friend Tyler and I had mostly abandoned the woods in favor of more typical teenage pursuits: cars, movies, girls, part-time jobs. Then, late one October evening, Tyler had an idea. "Let's camp out in the woods tonight." It sounded childish at first, something we should have outgrown. But the more he talked about it, the more it appealed to me. Nostalgia, maybe. A chance to relive those simpler times before life had gotten complicated. Neither of us had real camping experience. We didn't think it mattered. We would only be out there for one night, after all. We gathered supplies. Tyler borrowed a tent from his dad's garage. We filled a backpack with snacks, water bottles, a couple of flashlights, and a portable phone charger. Just after sunset, we slipped out of my backyard and into the forest. At first, it felt exactly like old times. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, just far enough to keep us from walking into trees or stumbling over roots. We walked deeper than we ever had before, guided by a mixture of confidence and youthful recklessness. After about 30 minutes, we found a small clearing, a patch of grass surrounded by tall, slender trees. It was perfect. Tyler wedged one of the flashlights into a bush to create a makeshift lantern while we struggled to set up the tent. It wasn't as easy as we had imagined. The tent was old and stubborn, collapsing twice before we managed to get it standing. Each time it fell, we had to retrieve the flashlight and scan the woods for any imagined threats. The forest felt different at night. What had once been familiar now seemed foreign, every rustle and snap amplified by darkness. Once the tent was finally up, we crawled inside and tried to relax. But relaxation proved difficult. Outside, the woods were eerily silent. No owls, no crickets, just the occasional creak of branches shifting in the breeze. We passed the time by talking quietly, sharing old stories, laughing nervously at how easily spooked we were becoming. Then, around midnight, we heard the footsteps. Soft at first, measured, human. They circled the tent slowly. We froze, holding our breath. I whispered that it was probably another kid or a neighbor playing a prank. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The steps continued for nearly a minute before fading away into the trees. We sat in silence, too afraid to move or speak. Eventually, Tyler suggested we leave the tent and sit by the fire pit we had built earlier, though we had never actually lit a fire. Out in the open, at least we would not feel so trapped. We gathered our things and stepped into the clearing. For a while, nothing happened. Then, the footsteps returned. This time, they approached from the darkness beyond our flashlight's reach. They grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the beam of light. Whoever it was stood still, breathing softly enough that we could barely hear it. We could not see them, and they did not speak. We waited, hearts pounding. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, but not directly. They circled us again. It was deliberate, controlled. This wasn't someone lost. This was someone stalking us. Tyler grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. But the footsteps continued, slow and steady. Whoever it was refused to reveal themselves. The second they began moving away again, we made a decision. We tore down the tent as fast as we could, shoving everything haphazardly into the backpack. Then we left. We didn't follow the trail we had come in on. In our panic, we simply moved toward what we hoped was the direction of my backyard. We walked fast, too frightened to run, but desperate to put distance between ourselves and the clearing. The footsteps followed. Sometimes they were close. Sometimes they seemed to vanish. But they never stopped entirely. After what must have been 20 minutes, we emerged onto a neighboring street, far from where we had entered the forest. The relief of seeing streetlights nearly dropped me to my knees. We walked back to my house in silence, both too shaken to speak. That night, we stayed up in my room, reviewing every detail, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never did. The next morning, Tyler went back to the clearing in daylight while I stayed behind, too unnerved to return. He found no footprints, no signs of anyone else. The only thing left was the impression of where our tent had stood. Whoever had followed us, whoever had deliberately stayed just out of sight, had vanished. We never went back into those woods again. And even now, as an adult, I avoid isolated places. Because that night taught me something no horror story or campfire tale ever could. The real fear isn't in what you can see. It's in what chooses not to be seen. It was early March, 2 years ago, when I took my camper out for what should have been another peaceful midweek camping trip. The woods behind my house stretched for miles, threaded with old logging roads and dirt paths just wide enough to fit my truck and the small camper I had attached to it. I loved camping out there. It let me step away from the constant pressure of work and the suffocating grind of city life. This particular trip wasn't meant to be anything special. Just 2 nights at my usual spot by the lake. The lake itself wasn't large or scenic, but it was quiet and remote. No one else ever came out there, and that was exactly how I liked it. That morning, I loaded my supplies into the truck, hitched up the camper, and followed the familiar trail into the woods. The drive took about 40 minutes, winding past thickets of brush and tall stands of bare trees. Winter still clung to the air. The ground was soft but not muddy. When I reached the clearing by the lake, I unhitched the camper and spent the next hour setting up my little site. I unfolded a chair, gathered some stones to rebuild my fire pit, and prepared the basics for the night ahead. Once everything was in place, I took a walk along the lake's edge. That was when I noticed something strange. A trailer. It sat about 50 yards from my camper, partially hidden between a cluster of trees. Old, rusted, its windows dark. I stopped immediately. I had camped at this lake for years. I knew every tree, every bend in the shoreline. That trailer had never been there before. Someone had moved it recently. I stood still, listening. The woods were quiet, only the soft rustle of wind in the branches. No voices, no movement. After a long moment, I approached cautiously, stopping a good 20 feet away. The trailer's sides were streaked with grime. The wheels were caked with dried mud, suggesting it had been hauled in from somewhere not long ago. No smoke, no lights. No signs of anyone inside. I called out a simple greeting. No answer. I knocked lightly on the metal door. No response. There was no padlock, but the door was closed tight. I felt the unease creeping in, but told myself it was probably just an old hunter's shack or a makeshift shelter someone had left behind. Still, I backed away and returned to my camper. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I gathered wood, started a small fire, and cooked dinner as the sun sank below the trees. For a while, the peace I had come for returned. The sky faded from orange to purple to deep black. Stars blinked into view. Then I heard it. Footsteps, crunching softly over the dried leaves behind me. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing but trees. The footsteps stopped. A moment later, I spotted a light. A small handheld flashlight weaving between the trunks. Someone walking toward the lake. I stayed still, watching. The light moved steadily, growing closer. But then, just before it emerged into the clearing, it shut off. Silence. My heart began to race. I waited, flashlight ready, expecting the person to call out. Maybe a hiker or another camper who had gotten turned around. But no voice came. Then, faintly, I heard the footsteps again. Soft, careful, deliberate. Whoever it was trying to approach quietly. I stood up and called out firmly, demanding to know who was there. The footsteps stopped again. No reply. Then they retreated, fading into the woods toward the trailer. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the camper, door locked, revolver resting on the small table beside me. I checked the windows constantly. At some point, maybe an hour before dawn, I heard footsteps circle the camper once, then retreat again. By morning, there was no sign of anyone, but I knew what I had to do. I packed up, hitched the camper to my truck, and left. Once I had cell service, I called the county sheriff and reported the strange encounter. They agreed to meet me the next morning to investigate. When I returned with 2 deputies, I led them down the trail to the clearing, but the trailer was gone. No sign of it anywhere. Instead, there were long, deep tracks in the dirt. leading from where the trailer had stood down to the edge of the lake. The tracks disappeared into the water. The deputies followed the trail as far as they could, but found nothing else. The trailer, whatever it had contained, had been hauled into the lake and submerged. No other evidence. No footprints. No personal belongings. Just the empty clearing and the cold, silent water. The deputies took my statement, filed a report, and said they would contact the state search and rescue team about possibly dredging the lake. But nothing ever came of it. No one retrieved the trailer. No one returned my follow-up calls. To this day, I don't know who was out there that night, or what they were hiding, but I cannot forget the footsteps circling my camper in the dark. And the terrible thought that if I had not locked the door, if I had not kept my light ready and stayed awake, I might not have left that forest at all. Some secrets sink beneath the water and are never recovered, and some are better left that way. It was the spring before last when I took what was supposed to be a simple, relaxing solo camping trip into a small forest preserve about an hour outside my town. I was 28 at the time and still fairly new to camping alone. I had done plenty of hikes and day trips, but this would be my second time staying overnight by myself. The area I picked was flat, easy to navigate, and had a short trail that led to a small pond. The photos online made it seem peaceful, almost picturesque. I told myself it would be the perfect spot. The hiking was easy. Less than an hour walking along a dirt path lined with thin trees. There was no one else on the trail, and from the look of things, no one had been there for a while. When I reached the pond, I was a little disappointed. It was smaller than I expected, more like a wide puddle surrounded by swampy grass. Still, it was quiet. I pitched my tent on a patch of dry ground about 20 yards from the shore. The afternoon passed uneventfully. I read for a while, ate an early meal, and wandered the perimeter of the pond. The opposite side was marshy and thick with reeds. No sign of other people. No camps. No footprints. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows across the water. I gathered some sticks and lit a small fire to ward off the evening chill. It wasn't long after full darkness fell that I noticed a light. It came from across the pond, flickering faintly between the trees on the opposite shore. At first, I thought it was another camper's fire, but it was too bright and steady, more like a flashlight. I watched it for nearly an hour. It stayed in one place, occasionally bobbing or swaying as if someone was moving it slightly. Then, without warning, the light dimmed and went out. The forest seemed to grow quieter in its absence. I sat by my fire for a while longer, telling myself it was probably another hiker or a fisherman who had decided to leave early. Eventually, I retreated into my tent and drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke at dawn, the pond was still and misty, the air cold enough to make my breath visible. I decided to check out the area where I had seen the light. Curiosity got the better of me. I crossed around the pond carefully, moving through the damp grass and reeds. It did not take long to find what I was looking for. A large flashlight lay on the ground, its casing nearly new. The batteries were dead. There were no other signs of anyone. No footprints, no gear. I left the flashlight where it was and made my way back toward my camp. That was when I froze. Two men were standing by my fire pit. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other thinner, wearing a dark hood pulled up over his head. They were going through my belongings, picking up items, examining them, setting them down. Neither spoke. As I stood half-hidden in the trees, the thinner man straightened and scanned the tree line. His gaze passed over the trees until it landed directly on me. Even at that distance, I felt the weight of his stare. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they would not be able to make me out clearly in the morning fog. For a moment, no one moved. Then the taller man turned toward the pond, and the two of them began walking along the shoreline in my direction. Not running. Walking steadily, purposefully. I backed away into the trees, trying to stay quiet. But when I looked again, one of the men had left the shoreline and was moving quickly through the trees, cutting across to intercept me. My pulse raced. Without thinking, I turned and ran deeper into the woods, moving as fast as I could without tripping over roots and underbrush. I didn't follow the trail. I didn't want to be predictable. For the next 20 minutes, I moved in a wide arc away from the pond, circling back only when I thought I had lost them. I never saw the men again. Eventually, I found a familiar landmark, a crooked tree by a dry creek bed, and used it to navigate back toward the trailhead. My car was still there. No one else was. I drove straight to the nearest police station and filed a report. The officers listened carefully and agreed to investigate. When they arrived at my campsite later that morning, it had been stripped clean. My tent, my backpack, even the flashlight across the pond, all gone. No footprints remained. The damp grass had been trampled and muddied beyond recognition. It was as if no one had ever been there at all. The police took my statement seriously, but without evidence, they had little to go on. No arrests were made. No suspects identified. I never got my gear back. And to this day, I do not know who those men were or what they had planned. But in my gut, I believe the flashlight across the pond had not been left behind by accident. It was bait, a lure to draw me away from camp. And if I had been slower, if I had hesitated even a moment longer when they began approaching, I am certain I would not be here to tell this story now. My girlfriend and I had always found peace in escaping to the wilderness. Life was overwhelming during the week, so our weekend camping trips had become a ritual, a way to shake off the stress and noise. We lived deep in Virginia, right in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains. The trails there felt like a second home. We had ventured into the woods dozens of times, sometimes together, sometimes with friends. Never once had anything gone seriously wrong. That changed on one rainy Saturday. We chose a short trail that wound about 3 miles upward to a secluded campground perched on a flat clearing. Neither of us had been to that particular spot before, but it was well reviewed online and seemed like a safe, peaceful retreat. The drive was short, under an hour, but as we neared the trailhead, the rain came in heavy sheets. That was typical in the mountains, so we pressed on without worry. When we arrived, only a single car was parked at the edge of the forest. We found it odd that such a popular trail had just one visitor that day, but we welcomed the quiet. As we gathered our backpacks and supplies, my girlfriend pointed out something strange. The passenger door of the lone car stood slightly ajar. Rainwater had already soaked the seat inside. We looked around, saw no one nearby, and I crossed over to shut the door, assuming someone had simply forgotten to close it. The woods swallowed the noise behind us as we stepped onto the path. The rain deepened into a cold mist as we hiked upward. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the campground, mostly because the incline was steeper than we expected. When we emerged into the clearing, I noticed a small tent already pitched at the center, a one-person tent. We assumed its occupant was inside, sheltering from the rain. Wanting privacy, we chose a corner far from the other tent and set up our own. We spent some time inside, eating and letting our damp gear dry out. It felt peaceful at first. Then, as the light dimmed and the steady drumming of rain blurred the world outside, I heard voices. I unzipped the front of our tent. 2 men were kneeling just a few feet away, watching us. Their sudden presence jolted me, but they smiled and introduced themselves. They claimed they were staying in the small tent and had already been there for a few days. Something about them unsettled me. Their clothes were ordinary, tight jeans and t-shirts, not the kind of attire one would wear for days of hiking or camping in cold rain. Their tent was far too small to fit 2 grown men comfortably, let alone provide shelter for several nights. I introduced myself and my girlfriend politely, but the whole encounter felt unnatural. The men returned to their tent. We left our zipper partly open, a small slit to keep an eye on them. Hours passed. Darkness fell completely. We saw no movement from the other tent. It was as if the men had vanished. Eventually, we tried to sleep. Sometime deep into the night, I woke to the urge to relieve myself. The rain still poured, relentless. I slipped on a thin rain poncho and stepped into the night, staying close to our tent. That was when I heard it again. Voices, faint but distinct. I could not tell where they were coming from. I turned slowly, eyes straining through the darkness and rain. The small tent at the center of the clearing was unzipped and empty. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The two men had told us they would be staying the night. Where were they now? I rushed back to our tent and woke my girlfriend. She listened as I explained. Then, both of us froze as the voices returned, this time clearer, coming from behind our tent. I grabbed my pocket knife. My girlfriend began shoving supplies into our packs as quickly as possible. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The two men were standing only a few feet away. No expressions on their faces, no movement, no emotion at all. They simply stared. I will never forget those hollow eyes in the rain. I knew instantly we were in danger. They were not surprised. They were not afraid. They were waiting. My girlfriend peeked out behind me. That broke my paralysis. I whispered for her to run. She bolted toward the trail, and I followed, abandoning most of our gear. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I glanced back. The two men still stood there, silent, unmoving, watching. We sprinted until our legs ached. The rain turned the trail into slick mud, but we did not stop. For at least 10 minutes, we ran before slowing to a desperate fast walk, eyes flicking over our shoulders constantly. When the car came into view, relief almost overwhelmed me. Then I noticed it. The other car was still there. Its passenger door was open again. I wasted no time. We jumped into our vehicle and sped down a mountain road until we reached a gas station with bright lights and other people. There, we called the police. Officers met us quickly. We told them everything. Days passed. Then came the news that made everything worse. Investigators discovered the other car belonged to an elderly man who had recently been reported missing. The small tent at the campground had been his. All his possessions were gone. The two men, whoever they were, had vanished into the wilderness. Only footprints remained as evidence. The missing man was never found. To this day, he is not turned up. My girlfriend and I rarely speak of that night, but when we do, it always ends the same way. We both agree on one thing. We came far too close to something evil. I can still see those two figures standing silent in the storm, and sometimes I wonder how long they had been watching before we even noticed them. For much of my late 20s and early 30s, work kept me moving from city to city. I rarely stayed in one place for more than a few days. Though the constant travel paid the bills, it left little room for leisure. I often promised myself that if I ever found free time on a trip, I would use it to explore the outdoors again. That chance finally came during an assignment in Pennsylvania. I finished my work a day early and found myself with unexpected free time. Rather than sit idle in my hotel room, I searched online for local hiking trails. One stood out. It cut through thick forests and promised quiet seclusion, exactly what I needed. The next morning, I visited a nearby store and bought some basic hiking clothes since I had not packed any. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was just before noon. The area was completely empty. I was relieved. Crowds were the last thing I wanted. The path was long, about 6 hours there and back. I brought a small backpack, a water bottle, and a few snacks, then set off under the tall trees. For the first hour, the walk was perfect. The scent of damp earth and the rustling of leaves felt like a remedy for my hectic life. Then I saw him. A man sat beside the trail, head hanging low, face hidden beneath the hood. At first, he seemed asleep. As I neared, he lifted his head slowly and stared at me. His eyes followed me as I passed. He said nothing. Neither did I. A ripple of unease passed through me. I continued walking, but I glanced over my shoulder more than once. An hour or two later, I stopped to eat. I found a fallen log beside the path, sat down, and opened my backpack. I was there for only a few minutes when movement caught my eye. The same man was approaching. He walked steadily down the trail toward me. I stood, hastily stuffing my food back into my bag. Without a word, I turned and continued along the path. I thought I could simply outpace him. That idea failed quickly. Minutes later, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw the man jogging toward me. I moved aside, thinking he would pass by, but he stopped directly in front of me. His expression was blank as he reached into his pocket. Slowly, he withdrew an old, worn wallet and held it out. "You dropped this," he said. I looked at the wallet. It was not mine. I told him so, but he insisted. His eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto mine. "It is yours. Take it." I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. Alone, far into the woods, faced with a stranger whose intentions were unclear. Hoping to end the encounter quickly, I reached out and took the wallet. "You are welcome," he muttered, then turned and walked away down the trail. I stood frozen. My heart pounded. When I finally gathered my thoughts, I inspected the wallet. It was empty. Not a single item inside. The encounter unsettled me deeply. I wanted nothing more than to return to my car. It was around 4 in the afternoon. I still had 2 hours of hiking ahead. As I walked, the forest seemed less peaceful than before. I scanned the trees constantly, nerves raw and alert. Finally, near sunset, my car came into view at the trailhead. Then I saw the shadow. A human silhouette crouched behind my car. I stopped immediately. Fear gripped me. Running back down the trail seemed as dangerous as approaching. I weighed my options quickly. My keys were in my pocket. I decided to move silently toward the passenger side door, unlock it, and slip inside unnoticed. I eased forward, heart racing, fingers gripping the keys tightly. When I unlocked the door and climbed in, the man sprang up. It was him, the same man. He ran for the driver's side door. I slammed the lock down just before he reached it. He pounded on the window, face twisted with anger, shouting at me to return the wallet. I ignored him and scrambled into the driver's seat. The car roared to life. As I reversed toward the road, the man pounded harder, screaming incoherently. I sped away, watching in the mirror as he disappeared back into the trees. I drove straight to a small police station I had passed earlier. I handed over the wallet and described the man. The officers promised to investigate, though I never learned what became of him. That night, back at the hotel, the reality of the situation hit me. He had not been trying to return a wallet. He had been trying to trap me. I would never know exactly what his plan was, but the look in his eyes and the shadow waiting by my car told me enough. Now, whenever I go hiking, even for short walks, I carry a pocket knife. Nature is peaceful, but it hides many dangers. Some of them walk on 2 legs. Late October had always been my favorite time to hike. The air was cool, but not yet bitter. The forest quiet, but not barren. Most of my friends had unpredictable jobs, which meant I often went alone. I did not mind. Solitude on the trails gave me a peace I never seemed to find in the crowded world. That weekend, I chose a loop trail not far from home. I had hiked it once years earlier and had always wanted to return. The loop was long, meant to be done over a day and a half. I packed light but carefully, then drove out early Saturday morning. The parking lot was little more than a gravel patch at the edge of the woods. No other cars. That comforted me. The fewer people, the better. The trail started flat, winding through wide, grassy fields. By midday, I reached the forest and the lower slopes of a small mountain. The light grew dimmer beneath the canopy. The trail felt narrower, more isolated. That was when I noticed the man. He walked toward me from far down the path. I could not tell much about him at first, just that he moved steadily in my direction. As he drew closer, details sharpened. He wore no backpack, no water bottle, no supplies at all. That struck me as odd. I was at least 6 hours into the trail. No casual hiker would venture this far, unprepared. When he passed, he lifted a hand and waved. Out of politeness, I returned the gesture, though my instincts urged me to keep my guard up. I took only a few more steps before I heard the man stop. The dirt crunched behind me. I turned. He faced me now. "Where is your group?" he asked. The question rattled me. How did he know I often hiked with friends? Or was he fishing for confirmation that I was alone? I forced a calm tone and lied. I told him they were just a few minutes behind me. "Good," he replied. His lips curled into a smile. Then he turned and continued walking past me, deeper into the woods. I stood motionless, unease pressing heavily on my chest. I did not want to linger near him, so I continued down the trail. Hours passed. The light shifted from gold to gray. The encounter stayed in my mind, souring what should have been a peaceful afternoon. When it came time to camp, I chose a spot well off the trail. A small clearing half a mile into the forest, hidden by trees and brush. I pitched my tent and sat quietly as the sun sank beyond the hills. I ate a small meal, but had little appetite. Night came fully. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and tried to sleep. But I heard them. Footsteps. They came softly at first, moving toward me from the trees behind the tent. The sound was unmistakable. Not an animal. A person. I held my breath. The steps stopped only 15 or 20 feet away. Then, silence. Time dragged painfully. I lay still, straining to hear any sign of retreat. But the forest remained quiet. Whoever it was, they were waiting. Hours slipped by. Eventually, the faintest light of dawn crept into the sky. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. Nothing. Only the silent woods. Cautiously, I packed up my gear. My eyes scanned constantly as I worked. As I rolled up the tent, something caught my attention. Footprints. Clear in the soft dirt behind a tree near where I had camped. My stomach sank. Whoever had approached me had not left during the night. They had stood close, watching, waiting. I did not stop to investigate further. I hoisted my pack and moved quickly back to the trail. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my pulse race. When I reached the main path, I debated whether to continue forward or turn back. I chose to backtrack. I had a growing certainty that whoever had watched me would expect me to keep going forward. I retraced my steps all the way back to the trailhead. The journey took most of the day, but I did not relax until I saw my car waiting where I had left it. Nothing else happened on the hike back, but the footprints haunted me. When I told my friends, they agreed I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. I reported the encounter to the local authorities. They listened, took down the details, but there was little they could do. Now, I rarely hike alone. The man's face, his smile, his strange question, and the silent footsteps behind my tent remind me that not every wanderer in the forest seeks peace. Some hunt. It was nearly a decade ago when my friend, whom I will call James, and I went camping in Oklahoma. We had spent most of our lives hiking and camping together, often seeking out less traveled paths where few others ventured. We preferred to create our own trails and explore areas untouched by most. That freedom always came with risk, but we had never encountered more than the occasional animal or unpredictable weather. That trip should have been no different. We parked our truck deep in the forest, already miles from the nearest sign of civilization. From there, we hiked for hours along an old, rough path, barely visible beneath the brush. We carried only what we needed for a night or two. Nothing felt unusual at first. Partway into the hike, we stumbled upon something unexpected. A ruined structure, made of wood and hardened mud. It looked ancient, as if it had stood forgotten for years. But it had not fallen to time alone. Blackened scorch marks covered much of the remaining wood. It had been burned. We paused only briefly, exchanging a few quiet words, then continued on. The air felt heavier after that. The sky was overcast, casting the forest in shades of gray as the hours passed. Eventually, we found a small lake hidden in a hollow. We set up our camp near the tree line, up a slope from the water's edge. As night fell, we built a fire, dragged some fallen logs over to sit on, and talked about anything but the strange structure we had passed. The peace did not last. As the fire dimmed, James fell silent mid-sentence. He stared past me into the darkness. I followed his gaze, but saw only shadows and trees. "What did you see?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. "Someone is watching us." I turned again, scanning the forest. At first, nothing. Then, between the trees, low to the ground, a figure. Someone crouched, half hidden. Before I could speak, I spotted another shape. Upright this time, behind James, standing still beside a tree. A cold fear swept through me. As our eyes adjusted, more figures emerged from the shadows. Not approaching openly, but moving between the trees, silent and swift. Their footsteps made no sound against the damp earth. 10, maybe 15 people. Their faces were hard to see, but they were barely clothed, their bodies lean and dirty. Some held long sticks shaped into sharp points. Spears. James stood quickly. I followed. My hand gripped the small hunting knife at my side, though it felt useless in the face of so many. We called out, asking what they wanted. No answer came. Only silent stares. Then a few stepped forward. The fire's dying light revealed their faces. Their eyes held no kindness, only anger, or perhaps hatred. They looked feral, wild in a way no normal person should. James grabbed my arm. Slowly, we backed away, keeping our eyes on the figures. The crowd did not follow us at first. They seemed more interested in our camp than in us directly. That small mercy saved us. We slipped into the trees opposite them, moving carefully but quickly. We walked until we could no longer see the firelight, then found a low hollow among the roots of a large tree. There we stayed through the night, neither of us sleeping, both listening for any sound of pursuit. At first light, smoke rose in the distance. We could not see the fire itself, but it came from the direction of our campsite. We did not need to guess what had happened. They had likely burned our tents and supplies. We returned to the truck without delay and drove home without speaking much. At the time, we chose to treat the experience as an unsolved nightmare, something best left alone. Years later, James uncovered a disturbing possibility. He had read about isolated groups and tribes living in remote regions, hostile to outsiders. Some were known to burn campsites or even attack hikers to drive them away from their territories. If that was who we had encountered, we had been lucky. They could have chosen to harm us, yet had not. Perhaps they only wanted to send a warning. Now, when we plan trips, we research carefully. We no longer camp in uncharted areas without knowing who might already call the land home. The forest is vast, and not every danger is from nature itself. Some dangers walk on 2 feet and carry spears. I was 29 when I took that trip to northern Washington. I had always camped alone. It was never a fear for me, but rather a form of freedom. My friends never understood why I preferred solitude in the wilderness. Some of them even found it strange, but isolation brought peace. I could leave behind the endless noise of daily life and be surrounded by nothing but trees, rivers, and sky. Washington had always been my favorite state for camping. Its endless forests and jagged mountain ranges made it feel like another world. For that trip, I planned a 3-day, 2-night hiking trail. I would walk during the day and camp off-trail at night. I had done it before without problems. The first day passed quietly. I hiked for hours, following the winding trail until it seemed to dissolve into the trees. I found a small clearing to pitch my tent. The night came and went peacefully. The next morning, I rose with the sun, took down my tent, and repacked my gear. That was when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Behind my tent, the grass was pressed down into a perfect footprint. I crouched and examined it. It had been made recently, probably while I slept. I looked up at the surrounding forest, but saw nothing unusual. My pulse quickened. Whoever had made the print had walked right up to the tent. I followed the tracks cautiously. They led straight back to the trail, but beyond that, there were no other footprints. Whoever it was had vanished as easily as they had appeared. Trying to shake the tension from my mind, I gathered my things and set off again. The hours passed slowly. I stayed alert, watching for anyone else on the trail, but saw no one. The ground ahead was clear of any new tracks. By late afternoon, the sun began to sink behind the trees. I decided to set up camp deeper in the forest this time, farther from the trail. If someone had approached me the night before, I wanted to be less predictable. I found a small clearing, pitched my tent, and built a modest fire. As the last light faded, I sat beside the fire, letting my thoughts drift. The forest had always been a comfort. But that night, something felt different. It did not take long before I heard them. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They came from behind my tent, where the forest grew thick. The sound was soft, but clear enough to distinguish from animals. I froze, my hand gripping the heavy flashlight in my lap. I scanned the trees with the beam of light, but saw only shadows and endless trunks. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent again. For half an hour, I sat by the fire, turning the flashlight from one side of the clearing to the other. My heart raced. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustling of wind through the leaves. Finally, I convinced myself that whoever or whatever had been watching had moved on. I backed into my tent and zipped it closed. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that it had just been a passing animal or another hiker who had kept their distance. But I had barely settled when the footsteps returned. This time, they were heavier, faster. I unzipped the tent and stepped out with the flashlight in one hand and my handgun in the other. As soon as I emerged, I heard the footsteps retreating rapidly into the trees. I spun toward the sound, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But in the dirt behind my tent, fresh footprints marked where someone had stood. I spent the rest of the night sitting beside the fire, gripping the flashlight and gun. Every sound made me flinch. When dawn finally came, I examined the area again. The footprints were unmistakable. Whoever had been there had returned to the exact same spot behind my tent. I wasted no time packing my gear. I hiked the remainder of the trail without stopping. Every time the wind stirred or a branch snapped, I felt my pulse jump. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone had been there, watching, waiting. Since that night, I have been cautious. I no longer camp deep in the woods alone. And whenever I hear the soft crunch of footsteps in the night, I remember Washington and the silent figure who stood just beyond the trees. A few years ago, my husband and I took a road trip through the Pacific Northwest. It was springtime. We had lived in Arizona for most of our lives and longed for the cool air and endless rain we had heard so much about. When we moved to California for my husband's new job, we decided to finally experience something different from the desert. We drove a new RV, a Marbe Star. It was our first time traveling in it, and we were excited. We planned to stop at several RV parks along the way, staying a few days at each. One of those stops was in Upper Oregon. The park was small but charming, nestled between thick pine forests and a winding river. We arrived late in the evening. My husband went to shower while I stayed behind in the RV to make grilled cheese sandwiches. It had only been about 30 minutes since we pulled in, and we had not spoken to anyone at the park. That was when I heard the first knock. It was soft but deliberate. I paused, looking toward the door. In all the RV parks we had visited before, no one ever knocked unless we had spoken to them earlier. But we had just arrived. I peeked through the curtain. No one stood outside. I waited. 10, maybe 15 minutes passed. Another knock. Again, no one was there. The shower stopped. I knocked on the bathroom door and told my husband what was happening. As I did, I noticed a light shining through the bedroom window. A flashlight beam, moving slowly. My husband dressed quickly and stepped outside with a bat. He walked the full perimeter of the RV. Nothing. The park was mostly dark, the other campers quiet and distant. We decided to move the RV to a different spot, farther from where we had originally parked. After repositioning, we settled down to eat and tried to relax. My husband eventually dozed off on the couch. I stayed up, cleaning the small kitchen. That was when I heard the door handle move. It rattled gently, someone testing it. My breath caught in my throat. I woke my husband immediately. He grabbed the bat and stepped outside once more. No one. We moved the RV again, this time parking near the exit. By now, it was nearly midnight. Exhaustion weighed on both of us, but leaving the park entirely was not an option at that hour. We locked everything, kept the kitchen light on, and left the TV playing quietly to give the appearance that we were awake. Eventually, we went to bed. Sometime later, I woke to my husband shaking me urgently. His face was pale. He whispered that he had heard loud scraping at the front door. When he looked through the window, he saw two men trying to pry the door open. In their hands, he said, were knives. He had already called the police. We sat in silence, listening to the men scratch and pry at the door. Their frustration grew. We heard them muttering angrily and more forcefully trying to break the lock. Then, without warning, the noise stopped. Minutes passed. The quiet was almost worse than the sound. Finally, flashing lights swept across the RV windows. The police had arrived, but the men were gone. The officers searched the area and took our statements. One of them mentioned that another camper had experienced something similar a few nights earlier. We realized then that we had likely been targeted not for robbery, but for something far worse. The RV had been clearly occupied. The intruders had to know we were inside, yet they tried to break in anyway. By morning, we moved to a different RV park, one with tighter security and better lighting. We added an extra day to our trip, just to recover from the fear. That night left a lasting mark. Locks, lights, and crowded parks had always felt like enough. But I realized then that determined predators do not fear locks. They do not fear lights. They do not even fear being seen. They only fear what might greet them if the door opens.